A quiet welcome to Restful Historian. Settle in as we gently explore the history of how medieval peasants feared the end of the world. Before we begin, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find the channel. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now, find a comfortable position, perhaps dim the lights, or turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Let us now very gently push open a heavy oaken door, its iron hinges groaning softly, not with alarm, but with the familiar sigh of ages. As it swings inward, the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something indefinably ancient, perhaps the faint, musty breath of centuries, reaches you. You are stepping into the medieval world, a place where the sun and the moon were not just celestial bodies, but the grand timekeepers of life itself, especially for the peasant, whose existence was tethered to the soil with an unbreakable, often unforgiving cord. Imagine the world through their eyes for a moment. Your horizons are likely bounded by the nearest dark, tangled forest and the distant, reassuring spire of a modest stone church. The rhythm of your days is dictated not by clocks, which you've likely never seen, but by the first, hopeful crow of the rooster, the precise angle of the sun as it climbs or descends, the persistent ache in your back after a long day coaxing life from the stubborn earth. The seasons are not just changes in weather. They are vast, unfolding chapters in a divine narrative, each bringing its own back-breaking toil, its own fleeting, simple joys, and its own deep-seated, gnawing anxieties. The rustle of leaves in an unseasonable wind, the silent, creeping tendrils of a sudden blight upon the precious crops, a sky that weeps rain for too many days. These weren't mere agricultural inconveniences. Oh no. They were whispers, perhaps even stern warnings from a world unseen, a world interpreted through the potent prism of unwavering and sometimes utterly terrifying faith. This faith was the very bedrock of their understanding, explaining everything from the blessed miracle of a good harvest to the chilling, inexplicable mystery of a neighbor struck down by sudden illness. The church bells didn't just call to prayer. They marked the slow passage of hours, sanctified the day, and offered a slender thread of familiar comfort against the vast, dark unknown that always seemed to press in from all sides. Every shadow could hold meaning, every unexpected event a potent sign. Life was a fragile, precious thing, held in a delicate balance between the tangible earth beneath their worn, calloused feet and the immense, unknowable, and often judgmental heavens above. From those vast, judgmental heavens, let your awareness now drift downwards, settling into the quiet intimacy of a new day. Imagine, if you will, waking in a simple peasant dwelling. The air inside your small, perhaps one-room, wattle and daub hut is cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp clay, wood smoke from last night's meager fire, and the close, human smell of shared sleep. It's an aroma as familiar and grounding as your own breath in the pre-dawn chill. Pale, gray light, thin and weak, filters through a tiny, unglazed window, or maybe just through the chinks in the rough-hewn wooden door, painting a dim, hazy picture of your sparse surroundings. You shift on your straw pallet, the rough-spun blanket coarse against your skin, the straw beneath rustling softly, a whisper in the stillness. There's no lingering in luxurious comfort here. The day and its endless cyclical demands are already stirring with that first tentative light. The very texture of your awakening is one of practicality, of necessity. Outside, the world isn't yet loud, but it's undeniably, irrevocably waking. A distant rooster, perhaps, its call still muffled and sleepy, hesitant. The soft shuffle of a neighbor, already tending to their few precious animals, the muted clink of a wooden pail against stone, a low cough from another hut, a door creaking open on leather hinges. These are the gentle, early sounds of a life bound inextricably to the toil of the land, a life measured out not by clocks, but by the slow, steady turning of the seasons. Each dawn a quiet, almost sacred promise of labor, of continuity, until the sun dips once more below the horizon. And as the sun finally climbed, pushing away the last vestiges of night, it wasn't just the promise of labor that greeted you. It was the vast, breathing canvas of the world itself. Imagine stepping from the smoky interior of your small dwelling, your eyes adjusting to the light. The air, cool and damp, might carry the scent of wet earth, the sweet fragrance of blooming clover if the season was generous, or the sharper tang of pine from the nearby woods. Each sunrise, painting the dew-kissed fields with soft gold, could feel like a direct, personal touch from a divine artist, a gentle reassurance whispered across the land. Yet this same sky, this same earth that cradled and nourished, could turn with frightening speed. A gentle breeze could become a howling gale, ripping thatch from roofs and flattening precious crops. A summer shower could swell into a raging flood, sweeping away livestock and bridges. These weren't just unfortunate events, not to the medieval mind. They were often seen as direct expressions from on high, a sign of displeasure, a test of faith, or perhaps a devastating, inscrutable judgment. The thunder wasn't merely a sound. It was a voice, deep and resonant, a reminder of an immense power that watched and sometimes frowned upon its creation. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that passed, every unseasonable frost or unexpected bounty of berries was a potential message. The world was alive with meaning, a vast, open book written in a language of sunshine and storm, of blossom and blight. And the medieval peasant, living so utterly immersed within this powerful, often capricious natural world, felt the hand of God not just in the soaring arches of a distant cathedral, but in the tremble of the earth beneath their feet, in the sudden chill of a shadow passing over the sun, in the terrifying beauty of a lightning strike splitting the night sky. It was a constant, inescapable presence. It was a constant, inescapable presence, this sense of the divine woven into the very fabric of their days. And while their known world, the one their feet trod daily, was often startlingly small, perhaps encompassing only the village, the surrounding fields, the nearest woods, and the muddy track to the market town, their understanding of the cosmos was anything but. Imagine, if you will, standing in the center of your known universe, a circle of familiar sights and sounds, the scent of wood smoke from your neighbor's hearth, the distant bleating of sheep, the feel of the rough-spun wool of your tunic against your skin. This was the tangible, the immediate. Above you, stretching into an infinity your mind could scarcely grasp, were the heavens. Not just the blue sky of day or the star-dusted velvet of night, but layers upon layers of celestial spheres, meticulously ordered, impossibly distant. Home to God, to angels, to saints, a place of unimaginable light and glory, yet so far removed, so utterly other, from the earthy toil of your life. It was a ceiling of breathtaking majesty, but also a constant reminder of your own smallness, your own fleeting existence, pinned precariously between these cosmic layers. And below the soil you tilled, below the deepest well, lay the shadowy realms. A place often spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, if spoken of at all. Not just a physical underground, but a spiritual abyss. The domain of demons and the damned, a place of eternal chill and despair. Its exact nature was a terrifying mystery, a dark mirror to the glories above, its potential horrors fueling a quiet, persistent dread. This tripartite world, heaven vast and radiant, earth familiar yet fragile, and the infernal depths lurking unseen, formed the grand, often terrifying stage upon which their lives and their fears of an impending ultimate ending played out. And on this vast, often terrifying stage, one institution stood taller than any other, its shadow stretching across every village, touching every soul, the church. It was the steadfast rock in a turbulent sea of uncertainty, the stone edifice that promised answers, however unsettling those answers might sometimes be. Picture yourself, for a moment, stepping from a muddy village track into its cool, cavernous embrace. The light, filtered through high, narrow windows, perhaps a rare splash of colored glass if the church was grand, would barely pierce the solemn gloom. The air itself would feel ancient, thick with the scent of cold stone, damp wool from the gathered faithful, and the lingering sweet smoke of incense from Mass, a fragrance meant to carry prayers towards the heavens. Here, amidst an echoing silence broken only by the rustle of homespun cloth or a distant, stifled cough, the priest's voice would resonate, often speaking in a Latin few truly understood. His words, and the vibrant, terrifying doom paintings that might loom above the chancel arch, painted vivid pictures of what was to come. These weren't mere stories. They were considered divine truth, the unshakable roadmap to eternity. The Church offered comfort, certainly, the solace of confession, the gentle promise of paradise for the righteous. But it also wielded the profound, heart-gripping fear of the Last Judgment, that ultimate day when every deed, every whispered secret thought, would be laid bare before the eyes of God. This knowledge, delivered with solemn authority from the pulpit, was a heavy cloak, sometimes warming with hope, often chilling with a deep, inescapable dread. And this dread, this heavy cloak, wasn't something easily shrugged off come Monday morning. It seeped into the very way they experienced the passage of days, the turning of years. Time itself felt different then, not the hurried, linear rush we often feel, always chasing the next thing. For the medieval peasant, time was perhaps more like a great, slow breath, or a vast, patient wheel turning through the heavens. Imagine your life measured not by clocks or digital calendars, but by the saints' days, each a familiar landmark in the year's slow journey. The feast of St. Michael, heralding autumn's arrival, the long, dark nights leading to the candlelight of Christmas, then the lean chill of Lent, giving way to the joyous rebirth of Easter. The rhythms were those of the earth, the first green shoots, the scent of hay in the summer sun, the back-breaking work of the harvest, then the quiet fallow fields under a blanket of frost. These were the markers, repeating year after year, a familiar ancient cycle. Yet, this comforting repetition, this circular dance of seasons and holy days, wasn't seen as an endless loop. Every turn of that great wheel, every harvest brought in, every winter endured was also one step closer. Closer to what? To that final, divine reckoning, the ultimate harvest of souls that the doom paintings so vividly promised. The circle wasn't endless. It was a spiral, slowly, patiently, but undeniably, drawing everything towards its foreordained conclusion. This slow march towards the final judgment wasn't just a distant worry, discussed only in hushed tones after Mass. It was woven into the very fabric of their days, as tangible as the rough-spun wool of their tunics. For the medieval peasant, the world was not an empty stage, simply awaiting God's final act. Oh no. It was crowded, humming with an unseen populace of beings who walked right alongside them, or perhaps hovered just out of the corner of their eye, their presence felt in a sudden chill or an inexplicable comfort. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer pressing reality of this. The air itself would feel different, charged with potential, with invisible currents of good and ill. A sudden, inexplicable warmth on a cold day. Perhaps an angel passing. A whisper of divine protection brushing your cheek. A silent guardian against the darkness that always seemed to press in. A shadow that flickers too quickly in the dim light of your hut. The one cast by a sputtering tallow candle with its faint sheep fat smell. That could be something far less benign. A minor demon, perhaps, come to tempt you towards a small sin, or just to spread a little misery, like curdling the milk or sickening the chickens. These weren't metaphors, not to them. They were as real as the mud on your boots, as undeniable as the gnawing hunger in your belly. Saints, too, were ever-present intercessors, their holy images. Perhaps a crudely carved wooden figure or a faded painting on the church wall, gazed upon with a mixture of reverence and desperate hope. Their stories, their martyrdoms, were a constant reminder of the spiritual battle being waged, a battle fought not just in some distant heaven, but in your very own village, in your very own heart. Every unexplained ache, every fortunate find on a dusty road, every whispered rumor of a miracle or a misfortune could be attributed to these invisible actors, pulling the subtle strings of fortune and fear, each event a tiny nudge toward salvation or damnation. And how would you learn of these grand designs, these divine timetables, ticking down to a final, fiery reckoning? There were no neatly printed newspapers, no crackling radios to tune into, certainly no endless, illuminated scrolls of information at your fingertips. News, especially the kind that truly mattered. News of God's unfolding plan, of sin, and of the approaching end of days, traveled on the breath of others. It arrived as fragmented rumor, as hushed warnings whispered over a weak ale, but most powerfully, most terrifyingly, it came from the solemn words of your village priest. Picture yourself, then, nestled amongst your neighbors on a hard, unyielding wooden bench. The air in the small, often damp stone church is cool, carrying the faint, lingering scent of beeswax, old incense, and perhaps the collective smell of unwashed wool and earth. Sunlight, if any, would be a pale visitor through a narrow, high window, doing little to dispel the shadows that clung to the corners and the rafters above. The priest, perhaps a stern man with eyes that seemed to see right through your soul, perhaps a kinder soul whose voice still carried the inescapable weight of his pronouncements, would stand before you. His voice, unamplified but trained to carry in the quiet, echoing space, would weave tales from the scriptures, interpret recent strange weather or a blight on the crops as divine omens, and remind you, always remind you, of the prophecies. Each syllable about the Last Judgment, the coming of Antichrist, the plagues, the sounding trumpets, would land with a heavy thud in the collective consciousness of the village. You might feel a ripple of unease spread through the rough-spun tunics beside you, a shared shiver in the dim light. These weren't just stories for a Sunday morning. They were bulletins from the front line of a cosmic war, delivered by God's chosen messenger in this small, isolated corner of the world. And in a life with so few other sources, his word was often the only and therefore the most potent word. So, as the priest's voice faded, the echo of those pronouncements would linger, settling like a fine, gritty dust over everything. It wasn't just the grand, dramatic sins that troubled the mind. It was the small, everyday failings. A moment of anger at a stubborn ox, a covetous glance at a neighbor's meager strip of land, even a whispered complaint about the endless rain. Each could feel like another stone added to a heavy sack, one you'd have to carry to the very gates of eternity. The concept of sin wasn't abstract. It was a sticky, persistent companion, clinging to your thoughts, staining your very soul, a constant low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily toil. And judgment, judgment was not a distant theological idea. It was a terrifyingly vivid spectacle, painted in stark, gruesome detail on the damp church walls, if your church was grand enough, or carved into the weathered stone around the doorway. You might see the gaping, fiery maw of hell, demons with wicked grins and hooked claws, dragging screaming souls into the abyss. You'd see the stern, sorrowful face of Christ the Judge, the scales weighing every deed, every forgotten sin. The thought of standing alone before that ultimate tribunal, your life laid bare, was enough to make the heart hammer against the ribs, a cold dread seeping into the very marrow of your bones. Against this overwhelming dread, the hope for salvation felt like a flickering candle in a vast, storm-racked darkness. Prayers, whispered hastily in the chill morning air, or mumbled over a thin, watery pottage, became lifelines. Penance, whether a pilgrimage to a local shrine on aching feet, or a few extra lashes self-inflicted in the quiet of your hut, was a desperate transaction for mercy. Every toll of the church bell, every saint's day, every ritual was a fragile shield against the encroaching terrors of the unknown. This constant, anxious dialogue with the divine, this fear of eternal damnation and the slender hope of paradise, wasn't just part of life. It was life, coloring every sunrise, every hardship, every fleeting moment of joy with the long shadow of what lay beyond. That shadow, you see, wasn't just some abstract concept whispered down from the distant, carved stone pulpit. Death was a much closer acquaintance, an unwelcome but frequent visitor to nearly every household. For the medieval peasant, life was an astonishingly brittle thing, wasn't it? Like a flickering candle flame in a relentless, unseen draft. Imagine, for a moment, the tiny, almost invisible threats. A simple scratch from a rusty plowshare, festering slowly. The angry red creeping up a limb like a tide. Or the chilling embrace of a winter fever, burning through a loved one with no remedy beyond whispered prayers and cool cloths. A failed harvest meant more than just tightened belts. It heralded the gaunt specter of famine, the slow, gnawing emptiness in the belly, the weakening of limbs. Childbirth, that miraculous moment of creation, was just as often a terrifying gamble, a path shadowed by the very real possibility of losing mother or child. Or sometimes, heartbreakingly, both. The village itself bore constant, quiet witness. You'd see the small, solemn processions to the churchyard, perhaps notice the scent of damp, freshly turned earth more often than you'd wish. So when the priest spoke of a final, cataclysmic judgment, a great unmaking of the world, it perhaps didn't feel like such an enormous, terrifying leap from their daily reality. If one small, precious life could be snuffed out with such chilling ease, then the idea of the entire vast tapestry of creation unraveling might seem not just possible, but almost inevitable. The end wasn't a distant, unimaginable horror. It was a magnified echo of the precariousness they already knew so intimately. And that echo found its most thunderous voice deep within the sacred texts, specifically in the vivid, terrifying visions of the Book of Revelation. Imagine, if you will, huddling in a cold stone church, the air thick with the scent of old incense and damp wool. The only light might be the flickering dance of a tallow candle, or a sliver of gray daylight filtering through a narrow, unglazed window. The priest's voice, sonorous and grave, fills the hushed space, speaking not in gentle parables, but of a lamb opening seals that unleash cosmic terror, of a great, multi-headed beast rising from the sea, of hail and fire mixed with blood cast upon the earth, and of stars falling like unripe figs shaken from a tree in a mighty otherworldly wind. These weren't merely stories to pass the time. They were considered divine prophecies, terrifying glimpses into a coming future of fire, torment, and celestial upheaval. For a mind largely unaccustomed to the constant barrage of images we experience today, these spoken words, perhaps occasionally reinforced by a stark, brightly painted mural on the church wall, would have conjured pictures of almost unbearable intensity. The four horsemen, conquest, war, famine, and death, weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were visceral, tangible figures, their presence felt as keenly as the winter chill. Such images, potent and unyielding, would burrow deep into the collective consciousness, seeding the anxieties that flickered, like uneasy shadows in the dark corners of a peasant's hut, destined to echo in their nightmares for centuries to come. The very heavens, usually a symbol of distant, unwavering order, were foretold to roll up like a scroll, and from that stark visual tapestry, the warnings would find voice. Inside the cold stone embrace of the church, the air perhaps thick with the faint, lingering scent of old incense, damp wool, and human breath, the priest would stand. His words, amplified by the echoing acoustics of the nave, were often the only formal interpretation of God's will, of the world's fragile state that most would ever hear. Imagine, if you will, huddling on a rough wooden bench, the chill seeping through your simple clothes. The priest's voice, perhaps a low rumble or a fervent cry, would paint pictures with sound, describing the trumpets of angels, the seas turning to blood, and the sky itself collapsing, just as those painted heavens on the wall foretold. He would speak of souls weighed in the balance, of the fiery pits awaiting the unrepentant, and the narrow, arduous path to salvation. These weren't gentle reassurances. They were urgent, often terrifying pronouncements, designed to shake the soul awake. For a people whose lives were already so precarious, so dependent on the whims of nature and the demands of their lords, these sermons added another layer of profound cosmic dread. The end wasn't an abstract idea. It was an imminent, vividly described possibility, preached with conviction from the very heart of their community. the place they looked to for solace and meaning. The flickering candlelight would cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, perhaps illuminating those same grim murals of judgment, reinforcing every dire syllable. Each sermon was a fresh reminder, a reminder that their world, and everything in it, could be swept away in a divine, cleansing fire, leaving them to face an ultimate reckoning they were constantly urged to prepare for, day in and day out. And beyond the spoken word, the very stones of the church whispered these truths, or rather shouted them in vibrant, terrifying color. The church walls themselves became vast, silent storybooks, their pages filled not with ink, but with enduring pigment. These weren't gentle bedtime stories, though. Far from it. Here, splashed across the rough plaster, were the dramatic, terrifying, and sometimes awe-inspiring frescoes of the Last Judgment. A constant, visual echo of the priest's warnings. A permanent exhibition of what awaited every soul, rich or poor, good or, more likely, sinful. Imagine looking up, perhaps during a moment of quiet prayer, or even just to escape the chill draft from a poorly fitted door. Your eyes would meet the stern, all-knowing gaze of Christ in majesty overseeing the great, cosmic sorting. To one side, the blessed serene and haloed, ascending towards a golden, peaceful heaven. But it was the other side, the side depicting damnation, that often held the most lurid fascination and the most potent fear. Grotesque demons, with twisted smiles and grasping claws, herded the condemned, their faces etched with eternal despair into the gaping fiery maws of hell. For a congregation that mostly could not read, these murals quinde were the scriptures. They were the undeniable visual proof of everything they were told. Each detail, from the instruments of torture to the agonized expressions, was a lesson burned into memory. The colors, perhaps ochres, blood reds, and terrifying blacks, even if softened by time and soot, delivered their message with brutal clarity. Every visit to this, their holiest sanctuary, was an encounter with this ultimate, inescapable deadline, a chilling preview of the end that always felt just around the corner. And into this simmering pot of quiet dread, other voices would sometimes arrive, unbidden, unexpected. These weren't the familiar, perhaps even comforting tones of the local priest reciting Latin they barely understood. No, these were the raw, urgent pronouncements of mystics and wandering preachers, figures who seemed to emerge from the very anxieties of the age, their shadows falling long in the uncertain light. Imagine them, gaunt individuals, perhaps barefoot, their clothes little more than rough-spun, earth-stained rags, testament to a life lived on the harsh edge of society. Their eyes might burn with a feverish light, a conviction that was both compelling and deeply unsettling, as if they had truly glimpsed the terrifying mechanics of the world's end. They carried no books, only the heavy weight of their visions, and a voice that could command the silence of a bustling marketplace or a hushed village green. The air around them might seem to crackle with an unseen energy. These self-proclaimed holy men and women would speak of divine revelations, of angels and demons warring in the heavens, their words painting fresh, immediate horrors onto the existing canvas of fear. Their sermons, delivered in the vernacular, the common tongue, were direct, visceral, easily understood, and all the more terrifying for it. They described the approaching apocalypse not in vague allegories but as an imminent, unavoidable event, sometimes even naming the year, the season, the very signs to watch for. Their words, potent and sharp, spread like wildfire through the tightly knit, anxious communities, carried on the breath of rumor from one village, one market to the next. Each retelling might add a new, chilling detail, a fresh wave of unease washing over listeners huddled together, seeking some impossible comfort in shared dread. Yet, woven into this tapestry of fear, a potent and often contradictory thread of belief offered a different, though equally unsettling, vision of what was to come. This was the powerful current of millenarianism, the fervent expectation of a coming 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, a new Eden, a period of unimaginable peace and justice. It sounded like a glorious reprieve, didn't it? A divine reward after so much earthly struggle. But here's the rub, the part that kept the dread alive and well, even within this promise of a golden age. This millennium of bliss wasn't just going to gently unfold like a spring morning. No, the common understanding, amplified by those same terrifying sermons, was that it would be preceded by a period of unimaginable upheaval, a great and terrible winnowing. Think of it as the ultimate storm before the calm, a divine purge, where the world as they knew it would be torn apart. Prophecies foretold a time when the very fabric of society would unravel. Kings might fall, the righteous would be persecuted, and the Antichrist, a figure of pure, seductive evil, would rise to deceive humanity. The natural world itself was expected to revolt, skies darkening at midday, stars falling like bitter fruit, the waters perhaps turning to blood, or the moon weeping crimson tears. Imagine listening for the distant, mournful blast of celestial trumpets, not with joy, but with a cold knot of terror tightening in your stomach, knowing it heralded this final brutal trial before any peace could even be contemplated. This wasn't just abstract theology, it was a future peasants felt breathing down their necks, a terrifying overture to a distant, perhaps unattainable paradise. Beyond these chilling portents of a world undone, one figure loomed particularly large in the fearful imaginings of medieval minds: the Antichrist. He wasn't merely a symbol of abstract evil, he was its prophesied embodiment, a charismatic deceiver destined to walk the earth and sow chaos with chilling precision. They whispered tales of his coming, a man who would appear outwardly pious, perhaps even handsome and persuasive. He would perform false miracles, making the barren field bloom overnight, or healing with a touch that felt deceptively warm, and speak with a silver tongue, his words like honey, all to lead the faithful astray just before the true end. Imagine the quiet dread settling in your gut like cold gruel, as you sifted through every rumor, every pronouncement from a wandering preacher, every strange new doctrine, wondering if this was him or his herald. He wouldn't arrive breathing fire, not initially. That was the true terror of it. His evil would be cloaked in an almost irresistible allure, his lies wrapped in half-truths that sounded so reasonable, so comforting, perhaps even divinely inspired. Picture yourself in a dimly lit, smoky peasant hut, the only sounds the crackle of a meager fire, and the wind moaning outside like a restless spirit. Someone mentions a new, powerful leader performing undeniable wonders in a distant land, promising an end to suffering. A deep, internal shiver might run down your spine. Could this be the one foretold? The one who would promise peace while secretly paving the way for ultimate destruction? This constant, gnawing suspicion, the fear of being tricked by ultimate evil in a pleasing disguise, must have been a heavy, invisible burden, a shadow cast over the rough fabric of daily life, making every unfamiliar face a potential harbinger of doom, and every supposed miracle a terrifying temptation. And this unease, this constant looking over your shoulder for the subtle signs of the end, would naturally extend upwards to the vast, often unreadable canvas of the heavens. Imagine a night darker than usual, the familiar stars winking innocently, and then a new visitor. A star with a fiery weeping tail, blazing a silent accusatory path across the inky blackness. This wasn't some distant, beautiful shimmer. It was a celestial announcement, a stark warning. Whispers would ripple through the village, each syllable heavy with dread. A comet, a messenger of God's mounting displeasure. Then consider the sun, the very source of life and warmth. Picture yourself toiling in the fields, the familiar heat on your neck, the earthy smell of turned soil in your nostrils, suddenly a creeping chill. The light begins to dim, not as it does at dusk, but in a strange, unsettling way, as if a giant, unseen hand is slowly snuffing out the day. The sun, that constant golden disk, appears to be devoured, piece by piece, by an encroaching darkness. Birds fall silent, livestock grow uneasy. For those terrifying minutes, as the world is plunged into an unnatural twilight, it must have felt like the ultimate betrayal, the most potent omen of all. The very eye of heaven, closing in judgment. These were not mere astronomical events. They were divine pronouncements. clear and terrifying signs that the end might indeed be drawing very, very near. Beyond the grand celestial warnings written in the sun and stars, the very fabric of the familiar world, the earth beneath their feet, could also betray them with unsettling signs. The rhythm of agricultural life, so deeply ingrained, relied on predictability, on the comforting cycle of birth and season. But when that rhythm faltered, when nature itself seemed to stumble, a profound disquiet would ripple through the community. Imagine the hush that would fall over a small village, the anxious, sidelong glances, when news spread of a strange birth among the livestock. Perhaps a calf was born with too many limbs, or a lamb with markings that resembled no earthly pattern, its bleeding somehow off-key, unnatural. You might see the farmer, his face etched with a new kind of worry, staring at this small, misshapen creature. It wasn't just an economic loss, a mouth that couldn't be fed or a hide that couldn't be sold. It was a perversion, a physical manifestation of a world teetering on the brink. The textures might be ordinary, the soft wool, the damp nose, but the form itself screamed of imbalance. These were not isolated incidents in the medieval mind. They were part of a larger, more terrifying tapestry. Tales would circulate, carried by weary travelers or whispered by the fireside on long, dark nights, of monstrous creatures sighted in distant forests or murky waters. Creatures that defied all known categories, cobbled together from nightmares and half-seen shadows. Each story, each unsettling birth, was another piece of evidence, another chilling confirmation that the natural order was unraveling, heralding a time of profound and terrible change. The world, it seemed, was breathing its last ragged breaths. And this sense of unraveling wasn't confined to strange births or whispered tales. It pressed in with a much more visceral, immediate terror. When the rains failed, and the sun, once a friend, beat down relentlessly, turning fields of hopeful green into brittle, dusty brown. This wasn't just bad luck. As the grain stores dwindled, and the faces in the village grew gaunt, their eyes hollowed with a gnawing emptiness, this was God's displeasure made terribly plain. The scent of dust and despair would replace the usual aromas of baking bread or simmering pottage, a thin, hopeless smell hanging heavy in the still air. Imagine, if you will, watching the river, your lifeblood for crops and washing, begin to swell. First, a curiosity, then a growing dread as it transforms from a gentle provider into a monstrous, churning torrent, its roar drowning out all other sound. It wouldn't just be water invading your small, thatched home, cold and relentless, smelling of mud and decay. It would be the tangible wrath of the heavens, sweeping away your meager possessions, your carefully tended animals, perhaps even your neighbors, in a muddy, indifferent deluge. The very ground beneath your feet, the most constant thing in your life, could betray you. When the earth itself shuddered and groaned, when walls cracked and familiar pathways split open with a sickening lurch, it was a profound, terrifying message. These were not mere geological events. They were sermons preached in devastation, divine punishments for a world that had clearly lost its way. Each trembling shock, each lost harvest, was another nail in the coffin of a sinful age. And then, sometimes, the threat wasn't a grand, roaring spectacle of nature's fury, but something far quieter, something that crept unseen into your village, into your very home. Imagine a stillness falling over the familiar sounds of daily life, a hush not of peace, but of a creeping, insidious dread. A cough, then another, a fever, burning through a loved one. And then, the telltale swellings, dark and ominous, blooming beneath the skin like a grotesque, unwelcome flower, the buboes of the plague. The Black Death, as it would come to be known, swept across Europe not with the sudden violence of an earthquake, but with a chilling, relentless efficiency. It was an invisible tide, washing over communities, leaving devastation in its wake. The air itself seemed to grow thick, heavy with the scent of sickness and fear, and perhaps, if you were near a town, the faint, sweet, cloying smell of overwhelmed graveyards. The constant, mournful clang of the death knell became the soundtrack to your days, each chime a fresh puncture in the heart of hope. This wasn't merely a bad harvest or a localized flood. This felt different, more absolute. Doctors, if your village was fortunate enough to even know one, were often as bewildered and terrified as everyone else. Their herbs and bleedings utterly useless against this unseen enemy. Whole families vanished in days. Priests, tending to the dying, often became the next victims. It was as if the very trumpets of the apocalypse were sounding, not with a blast, but with a rasping cough, a final, shuddering breath. This felt like judgment, stark and undeniable, a sign that the end times were not just a story whispered in church, but a terrifying, unfolding reality. And it wasn't just the unseen hand of disease that tightened its grip on the heart. Look beyond the village boundary, past the fields lying fallow or tended by too few, and the world itself seemed to be tearing apart at the seams. Endless wars, like a festering wound that stubbornly refused to heal, bled across the landscape. Petty lords, ambitious dukes, distant kings. Their quarrels became your reality, their trumpets of war, a sound as familiar and as dreaded as the church bell tolling for another soul lost. This constant grinding conflict wasn't glorious. It was a persistent, dull ache in the background of life. Imagine the sky, not blue with promise but hazed with the smoke of a burning barn, a torched mill, perhaps even a neighboring hamlet. The air, which should carry the scent of damp earth and growing things, was instead tainted with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of fear. Bands of soldiers, sometimes your own lords, sometimes the enemy's, it hardly mattered which when they were stripping your meager stores, their grim, hungry faces a terrifying mirror of your own anxieties. The distant thud of siege engines, the faint, chilling cry of men in battle, these were the unsettling lullabies of a world seemingly descending into madness. The very fabric of society, the bonds that held lord to vassal, neighbor to neighbor, frayed and snapped under such relentless pressure. Knights sworn to protect the weak sometimes became the predators, indistinguishable from the desperate brigands who now roamed the fractured countryside with impunity, their shadows long in the failing light. This was the chaos foretold, wasn't it? The shaking of kingdoms, the rising of nation against nation, as whispered in hushed tones after Mass. Each rumor of a new battle, each sight of a displaced family trudging down a muddy track, was another nail hammered into the coffin of the old world, another chilling sign that the final terrible chapter was perhaps about to begin. And amidst this tapestry of fear woven from famine, war, and the pronouncements from the pulpit, other threads began to appear. Thinner, perhaps, but with a stark, unsettling pattern. These were the whispers of those who stood outside the church's embrace, those branded as heretics. They too spoke of the end times, often with a fervor that burned even brighter, or a certainty that felt even more chilling than the priest's Sunday sermon. Their interpretations, sometimes wild, sometimes accusing the church itself of corruption, seeped into the worried consciousness of the populace. Imagine, if you will, a low-lit cottage, far from the scrutinizing gaze of the village priest. The only light is a flickering tallow candle, its greasy scent mixing with the smell of damp earth and unwashed bodies, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Here, a small, hushed group might gather, not for Mass, but to hear a different kind of prophet, someone who painted the established order, even the church itself, as part of the great decay that heralded the apocalypse. Their words, spoken in urgent, low voices to avoid detection, carried visions of a world overturned, of a judgment even more immediate, more radical, than many dared to openly consider. These messages, slipping through the cracks of official doctrine, were like illicit sparks in dry tinder. For the ordinary peasant, already burdened by a sky that seemed to weep unending rain and fields that yielded little comfort, these alternative apocalypses were profoundly disturbing. Who held the truth? Was it the familiar priest whose Latin chants, though largely incomprehensible, still felt like a distant holy thunder? Or were these intense, secretive figures the true harbingers, their eyes gleaming with a different kind of fire, promising a cleansing, terrible renewal? It was another heavy weight, another splinter of doubt and insidious anxiety, lodged deep in the medieval heart, making the rustle of leaves in the dark sound like the turning of a final dreaded page. And sometimes, that final page wasn't just a feeling, but a date, a number, whispered with a tremor of dread. Numbers themselves, you see, held a peculiar, almost mystical power in a world where literacy was a rare candle in a vast darkness. And for many, figures were abstract symbols, potent in their very mystery. They weren't merely for counting loaves of bread or the days until the next meager harvest. In the hushed interpretations of Scripture, or the fervent whispers passed from village to village, they became omens, stark and unyielding. Imagine, if you will, the feeble light of a single rushlight barely pushing back the oppressive gloom of a winter evening. The wind howls outside your wattle and daub hut, a mournful sound that seems to carry warnings. Inside, someone with a fragment of learning, perhaps a wandering scholar or a particularly devout elder, might speak of calculations, of ages and epochs foretold, their finger tracing unseen patterns in the air or on a dusty surface. The very cadence of their voice, low and serious, would lend an almost divine weight to these cryptic figures, each syllable a tiny hammer blow against the fragile peace of the evening. Certain years, like the much-anticipated and feared year 1000, a millennium after Christ, pulsed with a specific, chilling significance for some. For these anxious souls, it was less a date on a calendar and more a looming precipice. Biblical prophecies, with their 7s and their 12s, their 40 days and their 1,000 years, were poured over, their complex arithmetic twisted and turned until they seemed to scream of imminent doom. Each unusual comet streaking through the night, each unseasonable frost gripping the fields, could then be slotted into this divine, terrifying timetable, another tick towards the final reckoning. This wasn't just vague dread. For those caught in its sway, it felt like a coded message from God Himself, etched in the very fabric of time. And so, this sense of impending finality wasn't always a shrieking terror, a sudden jolt in the dead of night. No, more often it settled as a dull ache in the soul, a persistent, low hum beneath the surface of daily life. Picture, if you will, the familiar rhythm of your medieval day. The repetitive scrape of your simple hoe against the stubborn, thin soil, the distant, mournful lowing of a neighbor's cow as the pale dawn broke, the comforting crackle of the fire in your small hearth as the chill of evening drew in. Underneath all these earthy, grounding sounds there was another, far quieter vibration, the almost imperceptible thrum of anticipated collapse. It was the insidious feeling that the very air you breathed was thinner, more precarious than it once was, that the sun, though it dutifully rose each morning, did so with a little less certainty, a little less warmth. This wasn't merely a vague what-if. It became a profound conviction for many that the world itself was old, tired, and audibly groaning towards its divinely appointed end. Every difficult birth in the village, every field blighted by unexpected frost, every garbled rumor of distant war or spreading pestilence whispered a grim confirmation. The end wasn't just a distant possibility, a theological concept to be debated by scholars. For many, it felt deeply probable, imminent even. Like a colossal storm gathering just over the dark tree line, its ominous approach heralded not by claps of thunder, but by a subtle, unsettling shift in the light, a peculiar, heavy stillness in the wind, portending the inevitable. You might find yourself watching your children, their faces smudged with the earth of their play, but still bright with an innocence you felt slipping away from the world, and feel a quiet, piercing pang of sorrow, wondering if they'd even reach adulthood before the final terrible trumpets sounded their call. That sorrow would deepen, a cold stone in your gut, with every strange flicker of the northern lights, every unseasonable storm, every whispered rumor of a two-headed calf born miles away. These weren't just oddities. They were potential signs, cracks appearing in the very fabric of God's creation. The end, when it came, wouldn't be a gentle fading. Oh no, your parish priest, his voice low and resonant in the flickering candlelight of the small stone church, painted pictures not just of death, but of a terrifying, cosmic unraveling. Imagine, if you will, lying on your rough straw pallet, the familiar scent of damp earth and wood smoke clinging to everything. You wouldn't just be picturing your own demise. You'd be trying to grasp the sun turning black as sackcloth, the moon to blood, stars falling from the sky like unripe figs shaken from a tree. The very ground beneath your village, so solid and dependable, might split open, belching fire and smoke. The familiar sounds of the forest, the lowing of cattle, the distant church bell, all silenced, or worse, replaced by sounds no human ear was meant to comprehend. And then, beyond the physical chaos, the true terror, the judgment. Every small sin, every harsh word, every moment of doubt or envy, suddenly illuminated for all, and for God to see. Your life, usually lived out in the muddy fields and smoky huts, now scrutinized under an eternal, unforgiving light. It wasn't just about the world ending. It was about your soul's place in the unimaginable eternity that followed. That, perhaps, was the heaviest fear of all, settling in the quiet hours before a dawn you weren't always certain would arrive. With that profound weight settling upon every heart, what solace could be found? For so many, the only perceived path through the encroaching darkness led towards the familiar, yet suddenly more vital sanctuary of the church. The cold, unyielding stone of its walls, often damp to the touch, might have felt like the last steadfast thing in a dissolving world. Picture yourself perhaps before a dawn you weren't entirely sure would break, the air still carrying the night's deep chill. You'd make your way, along with others from your village, to the humble parish church. Inside, the light from a few sputtering tallow candles would barely pierce the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. The air would be thick, a mixture of old incense, the scent of damp wool from your neighbors' cloaks, and the faint, earthy smell of the packed dirt floor under worn leather shoes or bare feet. Prayers, once perhaps recited by rote, now tumbled from lips with a desperate fervor. Every mumbled Pater Noster, every heartfelt Ave Maria, carried the full weight of a soul teetering on the brink of eternity. The familiar Latin of the Mass, often half understood, now seemed to hum with an urgent, almost terrifying significance. Attending services wasn't merely a Sunday obligation anymore. It became a lifeline, a desperate clinging to the rituals that promised protection, or at least a less severe judgment. The shared silence in the church, punctuated only by the priest's intonations and the collective sigh of the congregation, was a heavy blanket woven from shared fear and a fragile, flickering hope. This intensified devotion was a shield, however thin, against the terrifying cosmic winds they felt blowing. But for some, this shield of communal prayer, a familiar ritual, felt far too fragile. The winds of impending doom howled too fiercely, demanding a more personal, more visceral response. If the world was indeed to be scoured clean by divine fire, then perhaps one's own flesh had to be purified first, here and now, through acts of profound, even agonizing penance. So, the well-trodden earth of the town square, usually alive with market chatter, might instead bear witness to a far grimmer spectacle, a procession of flagellants. Faces set in grim determination, or perhaps contorted with a strange ecstasy, they would move through the hushed, almost fearful crowd. The rhythmic thud and hiss of leather whips striking bare backs would echo off the timber-framed houses, a disturbing percussion to their chanted prayers. Each blow, a desperate attempt to beat out sin, to offer up their own suffering as a plea for mercy before the great and terrible day. The air might carry the faint, coppery scent of blood, mingled with sweat and the dust of the road. Others, less inclined to such public displays of mortification, yet equally burdened by the weight of their souls, would undertake arduous pilgrimages. They would set out on foot, sometimes for hundreds of miles, towards a distant, sacred shrine. Their worldly goods might be little more than a staff, a gourd for water, and a desperate hope. Picture them, a straggling line of figures against a vast, indifferent landscape, their feet sore and blistered, their bellies often empty, driven onward by the fear of eternal damnation and the faint promise of spiritual cleansing at their journey's end. Every weary step was a prayer. Every sunrise a reminder that the final dawn could be upon them at any moment. These weren't acts of madness. Not entirely. They were the actions of people profoundly convinced that time was running out, and that only the most extreme devotion could possibly tip the scales in their favor when the trumpets finally sounded. Beyond these arduous journeys, these grand outward gestures of faith, there lay a quieter, more intimate ritual, one that became an essential lifeline in a world perceived to be trembling on the very brink of its end. Imagine, if you will, the hushed interior of a small, cold stone church, the air thick with the scent of old, lingering incense, damp wool from peasant cloaks, and perhaps the faint, earthy smell of the graveyard just outside its crumbling walls. Here, the sacrament of confession offered a crucial, almost desperate anchor. It wasn't merely a religious duty ticked off a list. It was a profound, personal plea against an overwhelming cosmic terror. Each whispered sin, heavy with the grime of daily life. A stolen handful of grain to feed a hungry child. A lie told to avoid a beating. A curse uttered in anger against an unjust lord. A moment of forbidden, fleeting desire was laid bare in the semi-darkness. You might be kneeling on a cold stone floor, your voice barely audible, the priest a shadowy, often imposing figure, perhaps separated by a simple screen or sitting closely, his breath, smelling faintly of ale or meager rations, mingling with yours in the chilled air. He, often as unlearned as his flock but vested with an immense spiritual power, a direct conduit to God's mercy or wrath, would listen, his shadow perhaps looming large in the flickering candlelight. This act, this solemn unburdening of the soul, was a desperate spiritual cleansing. The weight of accumulated transgressions, each one a potential fuel for eternal fires, pressed down heavily on the conscience. To be found with a soul scrubbed clean, or at least as clean as fallible human effort and earnest repentance could make it, when the final, terrifying reckoning arrived, that was the fervent, whispered hope. Absolution, when granted, must have felt like a cool drink after a parched, soul-scorching journey, a momentary, precious reprieve from the ever-present dread, a fragile shield hastily erected against the anticipated coming fire and brimstone. With that fragile shield in place, some felt an even deeper pull, a need to lighten not just their souls but their earthly loads. A strange, quiet wave of divestment sometimes swept through communities anticipating the final curtain. It wasn't merely about giving alms from a surplus, a spare handful of grain, or a mended cloak. This was different, more profound. This was the hard-worn tunic, the one you'd lovingly patched a dozen times, now offered to someone with even less, its familiar weave a comfort willingly surrendered. It was the precious iron cooking pot, blackened from 1,000 hearth fires, gifted away, its familiar comforting heft suddenly a weight too great to carry into eternity. Imagine, for a moment, the rough texture of that homespun wool, perhaps still holding the faint scent of wood smoke and honest toil, as it changes hands. The decision to part with such essentials wasn't born of sudden abundance, but of a profound, soul-shaking belief that these material anchors would soon be utterly meaningless. Land, painstakingly cleared and cultivated over generations, might be signed over to the local church, the deed perhaps a simple scratch on parchment. A prized pig, the source of vital winter sustenance, and normally guarded jealously, could be given away, its familiar, cheerful grunts, a sound soon to be silenced, in the face of a greater, cosmic silence. This shedding of worldly goods was a desperate gamble on the promise of a new, unblemished world, a final, poignant attempt to unburden themselves, to arrive before their Maker with hands not just spiritually clean but physically empty. This desperate shedding of earthly ties, this poignant unburdening of hands and hearts, was often a deeply personal affair. Yet, as a particularly dreaded date on the calendar drew inexorably closer, perhaps a year ending in ominous zeros, or a day foretold by a wild-eyed hermit whose words, once dismissed, now echoed with chilling prescience, this individual anxiety could spill. It could merge, like nervous trickles forming a torrent into a widespread, palpable panic. The simmering fear, always present beneath the surface of medieval life, could boil over, gripping entire communities in a collective, breathless dread. Imagine for a moment the usual rhythm of your small village faltering. The rhythmic thud of the flail on the threshing floor might cease. The cheerful banter of women at the well replaced by hushed, anxious whispers. The smoke from cottage chimneys, usually a comforting plume against the gray sky, might thin as hearth fires were neglected. Instead, you'd feel a heavy stillness, punctuated by the urgent, almost frantic tolling of the church bell, a sound that usually marked time, now seeming to herald its very end. Eyes, normally downcast, focused on the muddy track or the furrowed field, would be lifted skyward, searching for portents in the scudding clouds or the indifferent stars. Perhaps a comet, a fiery tear, across the velvet blackness of night, had been sighted weeks before, its appearance now reinterpreted as a divine warning. The air itself would feel thick with unspoken fears, a suffocating blanket woven from shared nightmares. In these moments, the world wasn't just ending for individuals. It felt as though the very fabric of their shared existence, the rough, familiar tapestry of their lives, was about to unravel completely, leaving nothing but cold, cosmic wind. From this cold, cosmic wind, a new voice might indeed emerge, a fragile counterpoint to the silent dread. When the familiar comforts of the established church felt distant, its pronouncements too slow, too measured in the face of impending doom, other whispers would begin to circulate through the mud-caked laneways and huddled cottages. Imagine, for a moment, the hushed, urgent talk in the smoky fug of the alehouse, or by the flickering, uncertain light of a shared hearth. A new preacher has arrived, they say, in the next village, or perhaps a wandering holy man, his clothes ragged, but his eyes burning with a fervent, almost unsettling light, has set up at the weathered market cross. He speaks not of complex Latin rites that drift over your head, but of vivid visions, of direct personal communion with the divine, of a special, hidden path for the truly faithful to sidestep the coming inferno. His voice, perhaps raw with emotion, or strangely, deeply compelling in its quiet intensity, promises something tangible in a world that feels like it's dissolving into chaos. He might claim secret knowledge, a precise timetable for the apocalypse known only to him and his devoted followers, a revelation whispered to him in a dream or delivered by an angelic messenger. To ears already ringing with the thunderous pronouncements of doom from the parish priest, this alternative offered a potent, if perilous, sliver of agency, a different kind of hope. Or perhaps, a different flavor of fear, the fear of being left out, of missing the one true arc in a drowning world. These movements, often small and fleeting, flickered like desperate candles in the overwhelming darkness, each one a testament to humanity's enduring, sometimes heartbreaking, need to find meaning and a way out when the end seems undeniably, terrifyingly near. But when that desperate search for meaning, for an escape hatch from a crumbling world, led only to deeper shadows and colder hearths, the human heart, burdened with an almost unbearable dread, often sought a simpler, if far crueler, explanation. It's a profoundly sorrowful pattern we see woven through the tapestry of history. When the very air crackles with impending doom, when the crops wither in the fields under a brassy sky, or when unseen sickness steals through the village like a silent predator, it offers a perverse kind of relief to find a focus for that shapeless terror, someone to blame. And so the collective gaze, clouded by fear and suspicion, would often settle upon those already dwelling in the precarious spaces at the edge of society. Think of the whispers, starting soft as rustling leaves in the alehouse, then growing, carried on the anxious breath of a community convinced of God's anger. The outsider, the one whose ways were not their ways, whose prayers sounded strange to their ears. Perhaps it was the old woman whose knowledge of herbs now seemed less like healing and more like dark craft, her solitary cottage suddenly a focal point for communal fear. Or, with a tragic regularity, it was Jewish communities, accused of poisoning wells or profaning sacred objects, their very existence twisted into a cause for divine wrath. This wasn't about justice, it was about finding a release valve for a terror too immense to hold, a tragic deflection when the end truly felt at hand. But amidst this desperate earthly grasping for blame, this frantic search for scapegoats to carry the weight of an unbearable dread, another kind of striving reached upwards, towards the very heavens they feared might soon collapse. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the dim, cool air of one of those new, colossal cathedrals, slowly, painstakingly rising stone by monumental stone across the landscape of Europe. Outside, the world might be filled with whispered anxieties and the tangible grit of daily toil, but here, inside, light is transformed. Fractured into 1,000 jeweled shards by vast windows of stained glass, it paints the worn flagstones and the upturned faces of the hushed congregation with ethereal colors. The scent of incense, heavy and sweet, a perfume for the divine, mingles with the ancient grounding smell of cold stone and the faint waxy aroma of countless candles. These were more than just buildings, they were prayers made solid, testimonies in mortar and glass reaching towards an awesome, perhaps an angry God. Each soaring arch reaching higher than any peasant had ever seen, each intricately carved saint with its perpetually beseeching gaze, formed part of a desperate plea whispered skyward. Was it pure, unadulterated devotion that fueled these immense undertakings, the back-breaking labor of generations, the siphoning of precious resources? Perhaps, in part, but listen closely to the deep echoes that resonate in those vast naves. Feel the chill that clings to the shadowed corners, and you might also hear the thrum of a profound, collective anxiety. A hope, fervent and almost frantic, that such magnificent offerings, such tangible proof of piety, might somehow stay the divine hand, might appease a God whose judgment felt terrifyingly, imminently close. A colossal effort, then, to build a bridge to a heaven that, for many, felt less like a promise and more like a looming storm cloud, vast and unreadable. And that storm cloud of divine reckoning wasn't just a distant rumble in their minds, a vague disquiet in the soul. No, it was painted, carved, and displayed in stark and often terrifying detail, right before their very eyes. Imagine, if you will, stepping out of the weak medieval sunlight into the cool, echoing expanse of your parish church. The air hangs heavy, thick with the scent of old incense, beeswax, and damp stone. There, above the main altar, or perhaps covering an entire vast wall, a Last Judgment scene blazes with color. The fiery, sulphurous reds and oranges of hell's gaping maw, the glorious golds and serene blues of the heavenly host. You'd see the stark white robes of the saved, their faces turned upwards in rapture, and then the twisted, tormented bodies of the damned, their painted screams almost audible. Christ, positioned centrally, wasn't always the gentle shepherd. Often, he was a stern, unyielding judge, his gaze piercing, his judgment absolute. You'd trace the lines of demons, gleefully dragging souls into unimaginable torments, their forms grotesque, their grins malicious. It wasn't subtle. It was a daily, unavoidable confrontation with ultimate consequence. Then there was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, a theme that rippled across Europe. This was a different, perhaps even more unsettling kind of visual sermon. Picture it. A lively, almost grotesquely jaunty procession of animated skeletons. Each one, with a chilling grin, gleefully leads away a figure from every conceivable walk of life. A king still clutching his scepter, a bishop in his finest vestments, a wealthy merchant desperately trying to hold onto his bags of gold, a humble plowman, his tools fallen to the side, even a tiny, innocent infant. Death, the great leveler, held a grim sort of impartiality. It didn't care for your earthly station, your piety, or your protests. Its bony hand was an invitation no one could refuse. These images, whether as grand church frescoes or simpler woodcuts passed hand to hand, weren't mere decorations. They were constant, visual whispers, making the abstract dread of mortality and divine judgment terrifyingly, undeniably real, woven into the very fabric of their spiritual and daily lives. a stark reminder under every flickering candle's glow. So with these stark visions of mortality, these bony figures dancing before their very eyes in paint and print, did the ever-present hum of an approaching apocalypse truly seep into the mud and straw of daily life? It's a quiet question, isn't it? One that drifts like smoke from a peasant's hearth. Imagine, if you will, standing in a roughly plowed field, the damp, loamy scent of turned earth filling your nostrils, the chill of an autumn morning seeping through your thin clothes. If you believed, truly believed, the archangel's trumpet might shatter the gray sky before the next harvest was even gathered, would you still meticulously clear stones from that stubborn patch of land, dreaming of a fuller crop years hence? Would the thought of marriage, the joining of two souls and perhaps two meager strips of land, feel quite so full of promise for distant grandchildren? Or would it be a more immediate comfort, a hand to hold against a gathering, cosmic storm? For some, it's conceivable this sense of an ending, always just over the horizon like a dark cloud, lent a certain provisional quality to their choices. Why meticulously save those few precious grimy coins, each one hard-won, when earthly wealth would soon be meaningless dust beneath a collapsing heaven? Better perhaps to spend it on a little more coarse bread, a mouthful of watery ale, or to offer it with trembling hands to the church, a desperate down payment on salvation's hope. Others, no doubt, clung even tighter to the familiar rhythm of sowing and reaping, finding a strange solace in the ache of their muscles, the feel of the worn wooden plow handle, a defiant prayer whispered with every swing of the scythe. The uncertainty itself must have been a quiet, persistent thrum beneath the surface of their days, a companion to the wind in the thatch. That quiet, persistent thrum of uncertainty pulsed through every wattle and daub hut, every muddy laneway. For some poor souls, this drumbeat of impending doom simply ushered in a profound weariness. Why mend the leaky thatch? Why turn the heavy soil for a harvest that might never be reaped? You might picture them, still going through the motions perhaps, but with a new, hollow echo to their movements, their eyes fixed on a distant, fiery horizon only they could see. A heavy cloak of resignation, woven from fear and futility, settled upon their shoulders. Then there were those whose fear frothed into fervent action, a desperate scramble for spiritual purchase. Knees would grow calloused on the cold, unforgiving stone of the village church, the air thick with the bittersweet scent of incense and melting beeswax from countless prayer candles. Imagine the rustle of rough-spun tunics, the murmur of half-remembered Latin prayers, each syllable a fragile shield against the perceived wrath to come. Their voices, thin and perhaps a little trembling, would rise, a fragile chorus against the damp chill of the church, each note a mixture of desperate hope and profound dread. And for others still, the terror was not a solitary burden, but one to be faced, or at least acknowledged, together. Perhaps you'd see small, solemn processions snaking through the village, feet shuffling in the dirt, voices raised in simple, heartfelt hymns, a little shaky, a little out of tune, but earnest. A shared glance, a communal nod, small gestures of solidarity in the face of unimaginable finality. It was a way of saying, we are here, together, at the very edge of everything. A quiet testament to shared humanity as they awaited the world's last, fading light. That fading light, or the very real dread of it, had a peculiar way of pulling a community taut, like the strings of a shared instrument. Suddenly, the usual village grievances, a straying chicken, a fence post nudged a hand's breadth too far, would shrivel in significance. What did a chicken matter when the heavens themselves seemed poised to crack open? In the face of such cosmic uncertainty, the familiar faces around you, even those you might grumble about on ordinary days, became anchors in a storm-tossed sea. Imagine seeking refuge, not just from the elements, but from the chilling whispers of prophecy. Perhaps it was within the damp, cool stone walls of the small church, the scent of old incense and beeswax mingling with the earthy smell of unwashed wool. Here, the flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows, and the priest's familiar Latin phrases, though perhaps only half understood, offered a cadence of comfort. Or maybe it was simpler still, a A shared look, a communal sigh around a sputtering fire as night deepened, the faces illuminated in the orange glow, each one reflecting a similar unspoken anxiety, yet also a quiet resolve. This shared dread, paradoxically, could weave a stronger social fabric. It wasn't about grand pronouncements or heroic stands. It was in the subtle, human exchanges. The sharing of a thin ale, the collective murmur of a prayer rising like smoke towards the rafters, the quiet understanding in a neighbor's eyes. These were the threads that bound them. In this heightened atmosphere, the village wasn't merely a place of toil and obligation. It transformed, however fleetingly, into a sanctuary of shared humanity, a fragile bulwark built not of stone, but of common fear and common hope. But even amidst this tapestry of shared apprehension, woven with threads of faith and fear, it's important to remember that not every soul vibrated with the same apocalyptic dread. Picture, if you will, a peasant we might call Thomas. His face weathered like old leather, his gaze fixed more often on the horizon for rain clouds than for celestial portents. For Thomas, the end of the world wasn't necessarily about fiery angels or the sounding of trumpets. It was the immediate threat of a failed harvest, the gnawing emptiness in his children's bellies, or the sickness that could sweep through the village like a chill wind. The pronouncements from the pulpit, rich with dramatic imagery, might have been met with a weary nod, his mind already calculating the repairs needed on the byre roof before the next storm. The sheer, unrelenting rhythm of daily survival often left little room for sustained panic. The sun rose, the rooster crowed, and there was plowing to be done, animals to tend, water to be fetched. The scent of damp earth, the sting of sweat in the eyes, the rough chafe of homespun wool against the skin, these were the constant, undeniable realities. And within this, threads of skepticism surely existed, quiet and perhaps unspoken. A furrowed brow at yet another prediction, a muttered comment under the breath that the priest seemed to enjoy the gloom a little too much. Perhaps a pragmatic woman, stirring a thin pottage, thought more of adding wild herbs to stretch the meal than of the celestial mechanics of doom. This wasn't necessarily a rejection of faith, but a human capacity to compartmentalize, to focus on the tangible when the intangible felt too overwhelming, or simply too far away from the aching back and the rumbling stomach. But even the most pragmatic mind, focused on the feel of rough wool against skin or the taste of thin ale, couldn't entirely escape the pronouncements from the pulpit. The village priest, the friar passing through, these were the conduits of divine knowledge, or so it was widely believed. Their words carried the weight of heaven and hell, a heavy cloak for the congregation huddled on the cold stone floor of the often unheated church, the chill seeping into their bones. Sometimes those words offered a balm. Imagine the low murmur of Latin, a language not understood by many, but felt, its cadence echoing through the small, candlelit space, the flickering light dancing across roughly carved wooden saints. The priest might speak of God's infinite mercy, of the Virgin Mary's gentle intercession, painting a picture of a benevolent Father, forgiving and slow to anger. He might describe the saints as powerful friends in high places, ready to plead your case. These were reassurances whispered into the collective fear, a spiritual hand held out in the palpable darkness. The lingering scent of old incense, perhaps mingling with the faint, damp smell of earth and unwashed bodies, might even offer a fleeting sense of sanctity, a brief respite. Yet, this same voice, from the same wooden pulpit, could also sharpen the edge of that ever-present fear. The threat of imminent judgment, the graphic descriptions of torment, the fiery breath of apocalyptic beasts, the terrifying bottomless chasm of hell, these were potent tools. Did your thoughts stray during Mass? Did you shirk your feudal duties, or inwardly question the tithes that felt so heavy? The end was nigh. The priest might thunder, and only strict adherence to the Church's teachings, to its designated path, offered any sliver of hope for salvation. It was a delicate and sometimes not so delicate dance between solace and social control, each sermon a carefully calibrated measure of comfort and coercion. leaving the common soul to navigate the narrow, shadowed path between hope and dread. So imagine the fragile dawn, after a particularly potent prophecy, a date that had been circled in dread on the mental calendar of an entire village, has come and gone. The sun, utterly indifferent to human anxieties, begins its familiar climb, painting the dew-kissed thatch of rooftops in pale gold. You'd almost hear the collective, shaky exhale from 100 souls. A sound like a soft wind rustling through dry autumn leaves, a sigh too quiet to be called triumphant, yet heavy with relief. The distant, oblivious crow of a rooster slices through the morning chill. The ordinary, earthy smell of damp soil and wood smoke from a neighbor's awakening fire, usually just a simple comfort, now feels like a profound, almost sacred reassurance. The world, blessedly, stubbornly, hadn't ended. But this relief, potent and almost dizzying as it was, often carried a subtle, creeping undercurrent of, what next? The prophets, the wandering preachers, the learned men who'd so confidently deciphered the terrifying signs, they weren't always dismissed as fools or charlatans. Oh no! That would be too simple, perhaps too unsettling for a worldview so deeply steeped in divine machination and the irrefutable truth of Scripture. Instead, a quiet, scholarly shuffle would inevitably begin. Ancient texts were dusted off and re-examined by candlelight, complex numerology recalculated with newly furrowed brows. Perhaps it was a slight misinterpretation of a revered saint's cryptic vision. Or maybe, just maybe, the sudden outpouring of fervent prayers and desperate penance from the faithful had mercifully earned a temporary stay of execution, a brief, divine mercy. The date wasn't wrong, you see, merely postponed. The great celestial clock was reset, the dread pushed just a little further down the line, a familiar weight settling back onto already weary, anxious shoulders, ready for the next ominous prediction. And so, that familiar dread, once pushed away, would inevitably begin to creep back, a chilling draft under the door of the mind. One date, in particular, has echoed down through the centuries, whispered with a certain ominous weight. The year 1000 AD. Imagine for a moment the approach of that millennial dawn, not as a time of celebration, but as a potential final curtain call for humanity itself, especially if you were a peasant, living close to the earth and its sometimes terrifying mysteries. The nights would seem deeper, the shadows in the corners of your small, smoky hut perhaps a little more menacing. Every crack of thunder, every unseasonable frost, every sickly calf might be interpreted as a sign, a portent. The wind whistling through the ill-fitting shutters of a humble dwelling could sound like the mournful sighs of departing angels. The rough wool of your tunic might feel a little scratchier, the thin gruel in your bowl a little less satisfying, when the very fabric of existence felt so precarious. Of course, looking back through the hazy lens of centuries, modern historians now gently question just how widespread this specific great terror of the year 1000 truly was amongst the common folk. Perhaps the panic was more keenly felt in the hushed halls of monasteries, where learned men pored over apocalyptic texts, their anxieties amplified by literacy and theological debate. For the peasant, whose life was already a daily dance with hardship and the unpredictable whims of nature, perhaps one specific date for doom was less terrifying than the ongoing, grinding reality of their world. The end could feel perpetually near, regardless of the calendar. Yet, the idea of it, the pervasive sense of a world teetering on the brink, fueled by sermons and whispered rumors, must have added another layer of quiet unease to their days and nights, another shadow to lengthen as the sun dipped below the horizon. And sometimes, the most profound shadows weren't cast by famine or plague, but by the very institution meant to offer solace and divine guidance, the church itself. Its towering cathedrals might have scraped the heavens, but earthly squabbles could send tremors right down to the muddy village floor, shaking the faith of those who knelt there. Imagine, for a moment, trying to make sense of a world where not one but two, or even three men, all claimed to be the Pope, the holiest shepherd of Christendom. From distant Avignon, from Rome, From Pisa came conflicting pronouncements, angry denunciations, and excommunications hurled like spiritual stones. For the peasant, whose understanding of salvation was often tied to the familiar rituals of their local parish and the word of their priest, this monumental division, the Great Schism, must have felt like the spiritual ground crumbling beneath their feet. Whose blessing held true divine weight? Whose version of God's law was the one to follow to avoid eternal damnation? These weren't abstract theological debates for the farmer or the blacksmith. They were questions that touched the very core of their belief, the framework that gave meaning to their often harsh existence. The local priest, perhaps as bewildered as his flock, might offer what reassurance he could. But the news, trickling down through sermons or traveling merchants, painted a picture of a church in disarray. Such profound cracks in what was supposed to be the unshakable bedrock of faith could easily be interpreted as terrifying signs, dark omens whispered about in hushed tones after Mass, or over meager evening meals around a flickering hearth. If the church, God's supposed representative on earth, was fracturing, then surely the foundations of the world itself were trembling. The prophesied figure of the Antichrist, that great deceiver foretold to precede the final judgment, would have seemed not just a terrifying biblical concept, but a very real and present danger, perhaps even seen embodied in one of these rival pontiffs. The scent of incense in the village church might still have been familiar, a comforting aroma of sanctity, but now perhaps it mingled with a faint, acrid whisper of doubt. It was a cold draught seeping in from a world that seemed to be unraveling at its spiritual seams, where the ultimate authority could be so openly contested, and the path to heaven suddenly obscured by very earthly power struggles. This unease, this chilling sense of a world teetering, found fertile ground in the prophecies that circulated, carried on the breath of itinerant preachers, or whispered in hushed tones after Mass. And perhaps no voice echoed more profoundly in shaping these apocalyptic expectations, even if indirectly for the common folk, than that of Joachim of Fiore. Imagine him, a learned abbot from the sun-drenched hills of Calabria, poring over ancient texts, the scent of old parchment and beeswax candles perhaps filling his quiet monastic cell, a stark contrast to the damp chill of a peasant's hut. He envisioned history not as a chaotic mess, but as a divinely ordained unfolding in three distinct ages. There was the age of the father, stern, bound by the old law, a time of awe and obedience that felt ancient even then. Then came the age of the son, the era of the church, of grace and scripture. The very spiritual air the medieval world breathed, heavy with incense and the sound of Latin chant. But Joachim, with a scholar's intensity and a mystic's far-seeing gaze, looked beyond. He anticipated a coming third age, the age of the Holy Spirit, a future of spiritual enlightenment, where love and liberty would blossom, and the rigid structures of the church might even give way to a more direct, purer faith. However, this luminous future, this new spiritual springtime, was not to be ushered in gently. Joachim's writings, and the fervent interpretations that flowed from them like rushing streams after a storm, spoke of a period of profound tribulation, a final, terrible testing before this spiritual renewal. The Antichrist, they whispered, would emerge, a figure of immense deceit and power, pushing the world to the very brink. For the peasant, tilling his meager strip of land under a vast, indifferent sky, or huddled with family through a long winter night, such grand theological designs might filter down as fragmented, terrifying portents. A failed harvest, a strange alignment of stars, the distant rumor of yet another war. All could be woven into this tapestry of impending doom, a doom that, paradoxically, also held the faintest, almost heartbreaking glimmer of a renewed world just beyond the horizon of suffering. But that faint glimmer, that distant horizon of suffering, would soon be swallowed by a shadow of unimaginable proportions. Around the year 1347, something new and altogether more terrible began to creep across the continents, carried on ships, in the fur of rats, on the breath of men. A pestilence that dwarfed all previous anxieties. This wasn't just another failed harvest or a distant rumor of war, things they had weathered before. This was a palpable, creeping death that left an indelible scar upon the world. Imagine, if you will, the creeping dread in a small village. First, the hushed news from a traveling merchant. Then the first neighbor to fall ill, their coughs echoing in the thin-walled homes. Then the fevers, the delirium, and the grotesque dark swellings, the asterisk buboes, appearing with cruel intimacy in the groin, the armpit, the neck. The air itself would grow thick, not just with the miasma of sickness, but with the almost tangible scent of fear and decay, a cloying, sweetish odor that signaled the body's surrender. Entire villages fell quiet, the only sound the rasping breath of the dying, or perhaps the mournful tolling of a church bell, itself soon to fall silent as the bell ringer too succumbed. For the medieval peasant, already steeped in the vivid imagery of divine wrath and biblical prophecy, this was not merely a disease, this was judgment made manifest. The Black Death, as it seared its way through Europe, moved with a speed and lethality that seemed to defy any earthly explanation, wiping out perhaps a third, even a half of the population in its terrifying wake. It felt as if the very seals of Revelation were being broken, the plagues described in Scripture unleashed upon a sinful world. The boils, the swiftness of death, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it. Surely, many believed, this was the final tribulation. The world wasn't just teetering, for so many it was undeniably, horrifically ending. And as the shadow of the great mortality began, ever so slowly to recede, there was no true peace to be found, no gentle dawn breaking. For many, the terror simply shifted its shape, flowing into the well-worn grooves of endless conflict. Imagine, if you will, a life lived under the perpetual drumbeat of the 100 Years' War. It wasn't always pitched battles and clashing knights for the common soul. More often, it was the grinding, relentless attrition of resources, the gnawing anxiety of what the next season or even the next day might bring. The air itself might carry the distant, unsettling thrum of marching feet, or the acrid scent of smoke from a neighboring village, a constant reminder of the fragility of your own small existence. Fields, once green and promising, lay fallow or trampled, the earth scarred by the passage of armies. Your meager stores of grain, so carefully hoarded, could vanish overnight, commandeered by hungry soldiers whose loyalties were often as fleeting as their presence. Famine, that gaunt specter, was a frequent visitor, hand in hand with the mercenaries and raiders who cared little for which king claimed the land. This wasn't just hardship. For many, it was another verse in the terrifying hymn of the apocalypse. The book of Revelation spoke of wars and rumors of wars, of nation rising against nation. And here it was, unfolding not in some distant mythical land, but across your own countryside, year after agonizing year. Decades blurred into a lifetime of instability. When the very ground beneath your feet felt like it was perpetually soaked in blood and fear, and the sky offered only the smoke of burning homes, how could this not be the prophesied chaos, the final, terrible unraveling of the world? And when the world feels like it's truly ending, when the heavens themselves seem to weep ash and smoke, sometimes that profound despair doesn't just crush, it ignites. From this simmering brew of constant fear and grinding hardship, something else would occasionally boil over: revolt. It wasn't merely about an empty belly or an unjust tax, though those were certainly potent sparks. For many of these desperate souls, their uprising was a direct, often violent response to what they saw as the final days, a desperate attempt to forge a new, more righteous world from the ashes of the old. Imagine, if you will, standing in such a crowd. The air is cold, perhaps, before a threatened dawn, the only light from flickering torches casting long, dancing shadows on gaunt, determined faces. Your hands, raw from a lifetime of thankless toil, might grip a farming tool, a scythe, a pitchfork, now repurposed as a weapon. And at the head of this burgeoning force often stood a figure burning with conviction, someone claiming to speak with the voice of God, or an angel, promising that this brutal, bloody work was divinely ordained, a necessary storm before the calm of a purified earth. They preached of a world reborn, free of grasping lords and worldly priests, a world where the meek would finally, truly, inherit, just as Scripture foretold. This wasn't just a protest, it was a holy war fought by the forgotten, a final, fervent lunge towards a paradise they believed lay just beyond the next smoldering ruin. The air would be thick with prayers, with cries for justice, and with the raw, ragged sound of a hope so fierce it could almost make you forget the overwhelming odds, the trained soldiers, and the almost inevitable, brutal retribution that often followed. For a fleeting, terrible moment, they were not just peasants. They were the very instruments of God's will, reshaping a fallen world at the very precipice of its end. That sense of an ending, of a world teetering on the brink, wasn't just felt in the clamor of rebellion or the fervor of a holy cause. Sometimes, the most profound terror arrived silently, from the vast, dark expanse above. Imagine, if you will, a village night, deeper and quieter than any we might know today. The only sounds are the sigh of the wind through thatched roofs, perhaps the distant hoot of an owl, the world blanketed in an inky blackness largely untouched by artificial light. Then, without warning, the familiar canopy of stars is rent. A dazzling streak of light, impossibly bright, with a ghostly tail stretching halfway across the heavens, burns its path across the velvet dark. Or perhaps it's a sudden, frantic rain of light, as if the stars themselves are weeping fire, cascading towards the unsuspecting earth below. There's no rational explanation readily available, no comforting voice of science to soothe the primal fear. For the medieval peasant, gazing upwards with a mixture of awe and profound dread, this was no mere astronomical event. This was a message, direct and terrifying, from an agitated heaven. The air would crackle not with static, but with an icy fear. Whispers would ripple through the huddled onlookers. Was it a celestial sword, a harbinger of plague, famine, or the death of a king? Each fiery streak was a sign, a divine warning, perhaps a final, luminous threat before the trumpet call of judgment. The silence that followed such a spectacle would be heavy, pregnant with unspoken anxieties, and a renewed, fervent search for collective sin, for some reason why God had chosen to glare down so fiercely upon their small, fragile world. And into this profound quiet, this almost palpable ache for answers, a new voice might emerge. Not from the distant, agitated heavens this time, but from much closer, from amongst your own. Imagine, if you will, a figure stepping from the deeper shadows of the village gathering, perhaps near the dying embers of a communal fire. They might be gaunt from self-imposed fasting, their clothes a little too worn, their eyes holding a fervent, almost unsettling light that seemed to pierce the smoky air. This wasn't always the parish priest, but someone different. Someone who claimed to see beyond the veil, to interpret the rustling leaves, or the cry of a night bird as a direct message. A warning meant just for asterisk your small corner of the world. Their pronouncements, sometimes whispered with an unnerving intimacy, other times proclaimed with a sudden, raw intensity that cut through the evening chill, would fall upon ears already tuned to the frequency of fear. They might speak of visions, a familiar stream running thick with blood, the miller's wheel grinding to a halt forever, or the church bell itself cracking just moments before the final, terrible trumpet. The words, heavy with conviction, would weave a spell over the listeners. You might see faces, etched by harsh lives and now fear, turn even paler in the flickering torchlight, hands instinctively reaching for a protective amulet or a child's shoulder. For in these fragile times, a local visionary, a self-proclaimed prophet, could become a focal point of communal dread and, sometimes, a strange, desperate hope, their pronouncements echoing louder than any distant thunder in the anxious hearts of their neighbors. Beyond the chilling pronouncements of local prophets, a more intimate, everyday dread pulsed beneath the rough-spun fabric of medieval life. It wasn't just taught you when the world might shatter, but the deeply personal terror of asterisk, how you would meet your own end, should it arrive before that final, awful trumpet. Imagine, for a quiet moment, the rhythm of your day. The rhythmic swish of a scythe through tall summer grass, the comforting warmth of the sun on your shoulders, the earthy scent of the soil. Then, a sudden blinding pain, a falling branch from an ancient oak, a misplaced step on a treacherous path, the swift, unexpected onset of a fever. And then, silence. No time for the priest to be summoned from his chilly parish church, no hushed confession of a lifetime's sins, no morsel of consecrated bread, the viaticum, to fortify your departing soul for its perilous journey. This was the cold, gnawing fear, to be snatched by death's bony hand, unprepared. The church, that great overarching presence in their lives, taught that a good death was a managed one, a slow departure allowing ample time for repentance, for the vital, soul-saving last rites. The priests softly chanted Latin, the cool touch of holy oil on your brow, the final taste of communion. These were not mere comforting rituals. They were considered spiritual necessities, the essential toolkit for a soul facing the terrifying prospect of divine judgment. To die without them, to be unhoused, disappointed, unannaled, as a later poet would so starkly put it, was to risk an eternity of torment, or at the very least a far longer, more agonizing purification in the fires of purgatory. You can almost feel the collective, hushed apprehension that would ripple through a village when news spread of someone lost so suddenly, their spiritual fate now a heavy, uncertain question mark hanging in the smoky air of their neighbors' homes, a chilling reminder of their own precarious hold on both life and salvation. And this profound personal anxiety about salvation, this dread of an unprepared death, naturally fed into a wider, more encompassing fear, the end of the world itself. This wasn't a static, high-pitched alarm, though, ringing constantly in the ears of every peasant. Instead, imagine it more like a restless sea, this apocalyptic dread, its dark waves rising and receding across the medieval centuries, their very character shifting with the changing tides of life. Sometimes, it was a distant murmur, a theological rumble almost lost beneath the daily rhythms of sowing and reaping, the earthy scent of turned soil, the rough texture of homespun wool against your skin. You could, perhaps, push it to the back of your mind. But then, the waters would surge. A charismatic preacher, his eyes burning with conviction, might arrive, his voice echoing through the marketplace, painting terrifyingly vivid images of the Last Judgment. Or perhaps the familiar world itself would seem to conspire against you. A string of failed harvests, the sky offering only relentless sun or drowning rains, the thin cries of hungry children a constant aching soundtrack. The air itself would feel heavy, charged with an unspoken dread, a metallic tang of fear you could almost taste. In these moments, the fear wasn't just more intense, its focus might sharpen or change. Perhaps earlier anxieties centered on cosmic portents, comets blazing across the night sky, strange births, or the terrifying tales of Viking raids that felt like the wrath of God. Later, after the great plagues had swept through, the fear might become more intimate, more focused on the suddenness of death and the signs of corruption within society itself. The feeling that the world was not just ending but rotting from within. That distant murmur would swell to a roar, the shadow of judgment falling heavy and immediate. And so, with that shadow falling, how did one simply live? How did the medieval peasant, whose life was already a testament to hardship, carry this extra monumental burden, the quiet, persistent hum of the world's potential and often prophesied demise? It must have shaped their every sunrise, every prayer, every weary step taken across the muddy fields. Imagine for a moment your days marked not just by the rhythm of the seasons, the biting cold of winter yielding to the hopeful green of spring, but by an undercurrent of divine scrutiny. Every misfortune, every unexplained illness, every failed crop wasn't just bad luck. It could be a sign, a warning flare sent from an impatient God. The very air you breathed, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and livestock, might also seem to carry the faint, sulphurous taint of approaching judgment. The tolling of the church bell, a sound that punctuated the hours, could feel less like a gentle call to worship and more like a countdown. This constant proximity to the abyss, real or imagined, must have woven itself into the very fabric of their being. Their faith, a source of immense comfort and structure, was also a source of profound terror. The local priest, with his pronouncements from the pulpit, could offer salvation, but he also vividly painted the hellfire awaiting the unrepentant. So, life became a tightrope walk between simple, earthly joys, a good harvest, a healthy child, a village festival, and the overwhelming, ever-present understanding that it could all be swept away in an instant, not by flood or famine alone, but by the final, terrible trumpet call. Their understanding of fate, then, was likely less about personal ambition and more about divine will. What control could you truly exert when the script for the grand finale had already been written? Perhaps this fostered a certain stoicism, a resilience born not of hope for earthly improvement, but of acceptance. Or perhaps, in quieter moments, under a sky vast and indifferent, it sparked a desperate whispered plea for just a little more time, a little more mercy, before the heavens unrolled like a scroll. Those intense fevers of apocalyptic expectation, the ones tied to a particular Tuesday or the prophesied return of a long-dead emperor, did eventually cool, much like a summer storm might rumble into the distance. The world, after all, stubbornly continued to turn. Harvests were gathered, and children were born. Yet, the embers of that fear, or perhaps more accurately, that profound awareness of an eventual, divinely ordained end, never truly went cold. It simply settled deeper into the very marrow of their worldview, a constant, low hum beneath the noise of daily life. This underlying belief wasn't necessarily a source of constant, active terror. Instead, it became a lens through which everything was viewed. A quiet certainty that shaped their understanding of time, of purpose, of their place in a grand unfolding cosmic drama. Imagine, for a moment, seeing a comet streak across the inky, star-dusted sky. For you, perhaps a moment of fleeting wonder. For them, it could be a chilling portent, a message etched in celestial fire. A failed harvest wasn't just bad luck. It could be a sign of divine displeasure, a subtle tightening of God's grip. This eschatological framework, this pervasive sense that history was moving towards a final judgment, subtly colored every prayer, every moral decision, every shared story around the flickering hearth. It meant that the world, for all its earthy textures and immediate concerns, the scratch of wool, the smell of damp earth, the taste of thin ale, was also transparent, a place where the sacred and the profane were intimately, and sometimes terrifyingly, intertwined. The final chapter might not be for next week, but its shadow always lingered, a reminder that their small lives played out on a truly epic stage. And on that epic stage, specific dates would sometimes be whispered, then proclaimed, moments when the final curtain was expected to fall. Imagine the quiet dread that would settle over a village as such a prophesied day approached. The wind might whistle a little more mournfully through the thatches, the shadows in the forest seem a little deeper, the taste of your daily pottage a little more bland, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. Every unusual cloud formation, every late frost, every rumor of a distant plague could feel like a portent, a sign that this time, the end was truly nigh. Then the sun would rise on the morning after, just as it always had. The rooster would crow, the familiar scent of wood smoke would drift from chimneys, and a collective, shaky sigh of relief would pass through the community. The world hadn't ended, but this relief was often tinged with a strange kind of secondary anxiety. The prophecy hadn't been wrong asterisk in its essence, you see. The interpreters, the human calculations, those must have been flawed. God's timeline, its intricate celestial clockwork, was simply beyond their complete mortal understanding. So the fear didn't vanish. It merely receded, like a tide going out, only to inevitably return, perhaps clinging to a new date, a new interpretation. Each failed prediction, each uneventful dawn after a night of anxious vigil, wasn't a dismissal of the grand, divine narrative of a final end. Instead, it served as a quiet, often humbling lesson in the fallibility of human understanding when faced with the divine. The sacred texts, the pronouncements of holy men, they still held the ultimate truth of a reckoning. It was just the when that remained stubbornly, frustratingly, and perhaps mercifully opaque. The world, it seemed, would continue its slow turning dance towards that final unknowable day, and the peasant heart would continue to carry that fragile, persistent blend of hope and trepidation. The sun, then, would rise again, painting the dew-kissed fields with a familiar, almost indifferent light. Yet, the stories, those potent tales of a final, fiery reckoning, of celestial trumpets and scales of judgment, didn't simply fade with the morning mist. They were too deeply etched, too resonant with the human experience of awe and fear to be so easily forgotten. Instead, these powerful narratives began a new journey, seeping into the very fabric of what came after, a quiet but insistent hum beneath the surface of changing times. Imagine the flickering candlelight in a later chapel, illuminating a newly painted fresco. There, perhaps you'd see the same stark warnings, the same anguished faces and serene saviors, rendered with new techniques but carrying the ancient weight of that ultimate judgment. The colors might be richer, the figures more lifelike, but the message whispered from the plaster was an old, familiar one. The terror of hell, the promise of paradise. These weren't just medieval concerns, they were becoming timeless anxieties, constantly reimagined. And in the stories told, in the verses penned, the apocalypse found fresh voices. Epic poems might recount vast cosmic battles, while simpler allegories could explore an individual soul's perilous journey towards redemption or ruin. The language evolved, the settings shifted, but the core dread and the profound hope tied to the world's end remained a compelling undercurrent. It was a narrative too grand, too fundamental, to be confined to a single era's fears. Even in quieter hymns or more formal theological debates, the shadow of that final day and the promise of a new beginning continued to shape how humanity saw its place in the grand, unfolding story of existence, a legacy of unease and wonder carried forward. And so, this legacy of unease, this quiet hum of potential catastrophe, was carried forward, finding new expressions as the centuries turned. It's a curious thought to settle with as you drift, how that deep-seated fear of the world's ending shifts its very fabric with the times, yet remains so stubbornly present. Imagine, for a moment, the medieval mind. For them, huddled perhaps by a sputtering fire, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke clinging to their coarse garments, the apocalypse was a grand, terrifying opera, its libretto penned by a divine hand. Comets weren't just icy wanderers through the cosmos, they were celestial messengers, painting streaks of raw, silent warning across a vast, star-dusted canvas of night. A sudden sickness sweeping through the village, the chilling whisper of the plague, wasn't merely an ailment of the body. It was seen as the tangible breath of angels, or perhaps demons, conducting a terrible, indiscriminate lottery of divine judgment. The very ground trembling beneath their worn leather shoes wasn't the earth settling. It was a groan from a world overburdened by sin, a palpable sign from above. Our fears today, often illuminated by the cool, blue glow of screens rather than the flickering warmth of a communal hearth, tend to wear a different, more secular cloak. We speak of parts per million of carbon in the air, of viral RNA twisting into new, unfamiliar shapes, of the cold, indifferent mathematics of an asteroid's path through the void, or the unseen tendrils of complex algorithms. The divine script, with its angels and demons locked in cosmic struggle, has, for many, been gently set aside, replaced by peer-reviewed papers and complex predictive models. The struggle isn't always framed as good versus ultimate evil, but perhaps more often as a race between human foresight and human folly, or simply the unfeeling, impartial laws of physics playing out on a grand scale. Yet does the texture of that underlying dread, that primal flicker of alarm, truly change so profoundly? Whether it's the booming voice of a preacher promising imminent judgment from a rough-hewn pulpit, or the quiet, persistent scroll of a news feed detailing climate shifts, the chill that creeps down the spine, the subtle quickening of the pulse, the quiet, whispered prayer, or the frantic mental calculation for survival. These faint echoes of ancient anxieties resonate still. The language has evolved. The perceived architects of our potential doom have certainly changed, but that sense of vulnerability, the profound feeling of smallness in the face of such overwhelming, world-altering possibilities, remains a strangely timeless human companion, a thread connecting us across the ages. This profound sense of smallness, this ancient companion, was intimately known to the medieval peasant. When the sky seemed to crackle with omens, or the harvest failed yet again, their world, already so often teetering on the brink, must have felt perilously close to its final chapter. How then did they find a flicker of light in such pervasive shadow? Perhaps it wasn't in grand defiance, but in the quiet turning towards faith, the murmured prayers learned from childhood, carrying the weight of generations. Imagine the rough texture of a wooden cross, clutched in a calloused hand, the tangible plea against the intangible, or the shared breath of a congregation in a dimly lit stone-cold church, the collective sigh of hope and fear mingling with the scent of beeswax and old incense. Their solace wasn't always about averting the cataclysm, but about finding a way to endure it, to make sense of their brief, often brutal passage through time. It was about finding a narrative that could hold them, even when the world outside felt like it was coming undone. Ultimately, the story of medieval peasants and their fear of the end is profoundly, achingly human. It's a story of seeking meaning when confronted by the immense and the unknowable, a desperate, gentle reach for solace in a world that offered so little certainty. This quest to find a steadying hand, a comforting narrative amidst the chaos, resonates even now, doesn't it? As we too, in our own brightly lit, yet often bewildering age, look for moments of peace, for a quiet understanding in the face of uncertainty's persistent whisper, hoping to find our own calm amidst the storm. Thank you for joining us on Restful Historian. Until our next story, may your thoughts be calm and your rest deep.